Well, we welcome Father Alan from the parishes of St Clement's and St James.
Could you stand up?
Oh, I'm being videoed. The parishes of St Clement's and St James in London, and Grenfell Tower is in a few yards away from St Clement's Church. And we look forward to hearing you talk about, titled Grenfell, why we need the parish church and how the community responds when disaster hits. So, Father Alan.
It's a great pleasure to be with you today. It's lovely coming out on the Oxford Tube, coming out of London, so this is something of a day out for me, so many benefits for me for coming over to be with you. Can everybody hear me? Okay? Yes? I'm speaking loud enough? Great. So my intention is to speak for about 30 minutes, and I'm going to largely speak about what actually happened on the 14th of June, and there'll be some reflections threaded into that. So at 3 a.m. on the 14th of June, as fire shot up the Grenfell Tower, I did something completely normal. I did something thousands of priests would have done in my position. I opened up the nearby Parish Church. Assuming they were fortunate enough to have been woken up, as I was, they would have done exactly the same thing. And they would then have done all that I then did over the next 3 hours from 3 a.m. They would have welcomed people in, bringing supplies, water, bread, milk, biscuits. They would have opened up the toilets. They would have helped to organise people into teams, to set up tables and to serve breakfast. They would have directed traumatised residents towards chairs and tried to ensure they had what they needed. They would have supported the woman who put a blanket on the floor and played with small children. They would have done all these and many other small, practical things. None of this was in any way remarkable. But the response at St Clement's Church in the immediate aftermath of the Grenfell fire has come to symbolise the parish system at its best for many people. And I realised this summer that parish churches and community-orientated places of worship generally have a huge grip on the public imagination. Their commitment to neighbourhoods, to the small scale, to life below the radar has a value far beyond their apparent effectiveness. The aftermath of the Grenfell Tower atrocity has something very important to teach us about the purpose and identity of places of worship, and in particular the parish churches of the Church of England. And so to take you back to that appalling night, it began for me when I was half asleep. I could hear a helicopter overhead, emergency vehicles tearing along the road outside, and I was in that strange region between waking and sleeping. At first I thought I was back in Hackney, where I'd been a vicar for 17 years, and my immediate assumption was that there was a drugs raid happening. Then I remembered that for the past 7 years, half remembered, in that weird half-asleep state, that for the last 7 years I'd been in my current parish across the other side of London. So in my befuddled state I assumed it was simply a drugs raid over in Kensington. But then I registered that the helicopter had been circling for a very long time, and a number of emergency vehicles was immense and implausible. And I half thought, must be the biggest drugs raid ever. And at that point, the doorbell rang, and it was Sean Doherty, who Tom knows from school, a priest who lives very close to Grenfell Tower, few minutes' walk away from the vicarage. He told me that the tower was on fire, and we set off shortly before 3 a.m. on the 14th of June. The walk up to the Lancaster West estate felt unreal, but what I was about to see would heighten that sense of unreality. When Sean told me that there was a fire in Grenfell Tower, I imagined it would be something like a recent fire in a tower block in nearby Shepherd's Bush. That fire had been shocking, but it had been contained. When he told me that the Grenfell Tower fire was worse, I adjusted my expectations. However, the reality which I saw shortly afterwards was so appalling that I found myself struggling for a comparison, and rather pathetically came up with a film, The Towering Inferno. The Grenfell Tower fire was so far removed from anything I'd ever seen that a movie became my frame of reference, as if I were a member of an audience. And in one sense, this was completely understandable. How else could I process what I was seeing? But in another sense, it was completely wrong. I still tell myself I had only just woken up, that it was only the early hours of the morning, that I was already disorientated, and all of this is true. But was I also unconsciously trying to protect myself, to insulate myself, by in some way fictionalizing the whole event? I had to remind myself that this staggering atrocity wasn't something someone had conjured up. It wasn't an act of the imagination. It was really happening. Beyond the police cordon, in that massive, all-consuming fire, which was raging up the building, people were dying. It may not have seemed real, but it was. From the very beginning, the problem of accommodating the Grenfell Tower fire to our normal experience of reality has been complex. It has taught us to look at our society with new eyes. And even today, people, when they first see the tower, perhaps driving over West Way or just walking around the neighbourhood, can't really believe what they're seeing. It's like an intrusion of something alien. So I opened up St Clement's Church at 3 a.m. I felt an extraordinary sense of compression in the two actions of opening the church and switching on the lights. It was as if my entire ministry as a priest had found its purest expression. Why is that? Well, one explanation is to do with symbolism. An open door is a potent symbol of welcome, of hospitality. Parish clergy generally spend a huge amount of effort in keeping doors open, in both the literal and metaphorical meanings of the word. We generally want our churches to be inviting places of community and worship. We preach about the need for hospitality and inclusivity. We try to ensure that a visitor's first experience of a church is a positive one. And as enablers of a largely volunteer community, most clergy work hard to ensure that people feel able to participate. Where there is conflict, we find ourselves attempting to mediate. All of these tasks involve a commitment to keeping doors open. The open door is a routine feature of parish ministry. And of course, it's also a powerful positive symbol. Jesus described himself as a door and urged people to pray, urging them to knock and it shall be opened, seek and you shall find. The opposite of an open door, a closed door, is so antithetical to our understanding of our mission and ministry that it almost seems to be anti-Christian. And yet a closed door is also sometimes necessary, as we discovered in the aftermath of the disaster, giving people the privacy they need, especially when they're frightened, anxious, or need to discuss sensitive issues. In general, however, the open door expresses a core value. I open the door. I switched on the lights. Light is an even more dominant image in the Christian narrative. We say that Jesus is the light of the world. Candles in church remind us of this, but they also have a more universal significance. The act of lighting candles at vigils has become a common way of expressing both individual and communal grief, as well as hope. The lighting of candles is a natural and easily accessible symbolic gesture, regardless of our faith. Perhaps its power has something to do with the early days of our species, when fire brought people together, giving them comfort, warmth, and protection from the surrounding darkness. Children and some adults are often afraid of the dark, needing the reassuring presence of a nightlight. The turning on of lights in the darkness is a highly visible gesture of availability. It says, we're here to help. The light blazes forth, and those in need have a clear destination. They know where to go. Lighthouses warn ships of imminent danger. Lights show us the way. But in this context, on this particular night, there was more. St. Clement's is a small church tucked away from the main roads through North Kensington, situated amongst large estates of social housing. It's one of the relatively few, architecturally significant buildings in an area of which few were aware before the fire, Notting Dale. Even now, the term is much less used than the term North Kensington, which is a broader area. Many people know of Notting Hill and the Carnival, but the Dale, just down from the hill, is another matter. The perimeters of the Dale aren't clear, and the word has an oddly pastoral quality to it. But the Dale is where St. Clement's Church can be found with some difficulty, and where for decades the people and their clergy have attempted to live out their Christian faith and to serve the wider community. The roots of the church are significant. 150 years ago, Notting Dale was an area of terrible poverty, even by Victorian standards. The Reverend Arthur Dalgarno Robinson paid for the church to be built from his own funds and worked there for years without pay. It was a mission church in the best sense of the word, serving both the material and spiritual needs of the inhabitants. His name was eventually given to a local authority ward a little further to the north, in an area of still significant deprivation. The social gospel, which this embodied 150 years ago, continued in various forms through the 19th century into the 20th century, and was given fresh impetus in the late 1970s and early 80s by the vicar, David Randall. The community project of those years then became the Clement James Centre, which you may have read about in the news. In 2002, during the ministry of my predecessor, Hugh Raymond Pickard, the community work was professionalised and given a more sustainable fundraising base. The centre is a secular organisation, but the partnership between the parish and the centre has always been strong, and it's been a big part of my job to ensure that it remains strong. Before long, however, the Clement James Centre was faced with a dilemma. It had developed a highly successful programme for raising the aspirations and improving the opportunities of young people from deprived backgrounds. Should it extend this programme, which was clearly working, beyond its current base, its current local base, or not? Many more people would benefit if it did so, but there would be a serious risk of diluting its local character. In the end, another national charity emerged into university. In the meantime, the Clement James Centre has greatly extended the range of its provision building on its early achievements to become a highly respected, much awarded, and astonishingly successful local charity. The national achievements of Inter-University are equally impressive. So when I opened the church and turned on the lights in the early hours of the 14th of June, I wasn't beckoning people into a building which was in any way disconnected from the community. I wasn't beckoning them into the building of an isolationist sect. I wasn't beckoning them into a building which spiritualized the problems of poverty and social exclusion, or indeed any other problem. I wasn't beckoning them into a building which had been taken over as a church plant by a large middle-class church from a completely different postcode. Quite the reverse. I was beckoning them into a building which was embedded in the neighbourhood with a track record of community service which goes back decades. I was beckoning them into a space which has improved the lives of thousands of people, which has earned trust, and which at the same time is undeniably a church. St. Clement's Church didn't just become a symbol of the parish system at its best on the 14th of June. It was that already. When I opened the church and turned on the lights, I was doing what I'd spent my entire adult working life doing in one way or another. Crucially, I was representing a deep and historically embedded ministry in a particular time and place. I was in a tradition of service to Notting Dale which stretched back 150 years. In those two actions of turning on the lights and opening the church, I felt as if I was representing all those who had worshipped and worked from St. Clement's Church before me for decades. At 3 a.m. on the 14th of June, I hadn't yet grasped that I had entered the scene of a mass disaster. I was struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. My own reactions were confused, but I knew that the church was needed, and it was my job to ensure that it responded in the best possible way. But I was not alone. The burden was not entirely mine. The Christian witness and the brave decisions of many generations had created a context in which help could be offered effectively. But at that point, I had no idea how necessary that help would be. The first people to arrive at the church sought to offer help, not to receive it. They arrived with water. Before long, they were followed by traumatised residents and more helpers. They kept on flooding in. Some helpers were from the congregations of the two churches, St. Clement's and St. James. Some I knew already from the wider community. Others I'd never met before. But they all pitched in. Initially, we offered tea, then bread, biscuits, fruit. Someone brought in some toast. Bottles of water kept on coming. Firefighters came in. One knelt to pray and went out again. Firefighters were using the toilets, as was everybody else. We had to extend the tables. There was so much stuff coming in. And within a couple of hours, we had an extensive breakfast bar. And as I mentioned earlier, a church member set up a play area on a blanket for young children, using her own children's toys, which sadly those children never got back. They were taken away by the children who were playing with them in the church. rightly so. As it was Ramadan, many residents were fasting. They refused breakfast, even a cup of water, graciously and without any kind of ostentation whatsoever. I remember feeling concerned about their capacity to cope, how, in a state of shock, they would manage to get through the day ahead. We were only a week away from the longest day of the year. They would not break their fast until after 9:30 p.m. In the course of the day, various members of the Muslim community spoke to those who were fasting, pointing out that in exceptional circumstances it's permitted to eat and drink. I'm not sure how many did in the course of the day, but I'm certain that none did at that stage. So by 6:30, the hospitality system was well established, and increasing numbers of the Clement James Centre were also on site. Feeling I'd be more useful if I was refreshed, I went home for breakfast and a shower. I ate breakfast watching TV news reports. For over 4 hours, I'd been in practical coping mode in the familiar territory of a small homely church. Now I saw the scale of the disaster. On my return to church, I discovered that the situation was rapidly escalating. There were many more helpers, an increasing volume of donations, not only food and water, but also blankets and clothes. And the media was gathered outside the church. And it's from this point onwards that I find it hard to recall the exact sequence of events. All I can do is to mention key aspects of the day. The relief efforts soon spread into the beautiful gardens and office spaces at the back of the church. Local restaurants and a coffee company brought in food. Over the next few days, delicious and life-sustaining meals would be readily available in the garden, culminating with an iftar, a Muslim breakfast. As bad news filtered through, the centre staff found bereaved, evacuated families, quiet rooms in which to rest and mourn. A medical station was set up in the church. Besides helping people with conditions provoked by the fire, such as asthma, there was a pressing need to prescribe for medications which evacuees had left behind in their hurry to escape. Volunteers arrived in droves, and donations soon encroached on the available space in the church. As a result, as the day went on, much of the voluntary effort was dedicated to organising clothing and other items. By mid-afternoon, the church had turned into what one person described as the biggest jumble sale ever. The first day ended very late. In fact, it ended the following day. By 10:30 p.m, the media had gone. Most evacuees had made their way over to the Westway sports centres to sleep on a mat on the floor. The iftar in the garden was winding down. A group of volunteers in the church was doggedly sorting through donations. About half of the donations had been shipped off during the day, but still more were coming in, even though we had signs by that stage outside to say that we were unable to accept them. Church railings were covered with messages of solidarity and concern, prayers, information about groups of activities, appeals for information about those who were missing, and flowers were piling up on the pavement. All of this happened in the course of just a few hours. At midnight, I decided to close the church. Winding up took time, and it was nearly 1 a.m. before I was able to lock the garden gates at the back. As I was doing so, a man pulled up in a van. He came forward with several bags of jumble. I pointed out that we were no longer receiving donations. Compared with some of the more aggressive donors which we'd begun to experience during the day, he was a reasonable person. He had come from outer London. His wife had sent him off at a very late hour to help. She wouldn't be happy if he took back their offering. I was too tired to resist. I let him put his plastic bags in the garden, adding to the pile that gathered there, even in the course of the evening. People wanted to give, and we had to receive, even when what they had to give was not always useful, and their gifts had arrived in such a quantity that they far exceeded what survivors and other evacuees actually needed. And yet, it was only the end of the first day. Donations will continue to pour in. By the weekend, there was a movement by local organisations to normalise. People whose lives had been torn apart needed those serving them to function in a calm and focused manner. For me, this was nowhere more necessary than at the first Sunday service after the fire at the 11:30 a.m. parish mass. On Saturday evening, I had a call from the Diocesan Press Office to say that the Mayor of London wanted to join us at St Clement's, but his teams had concerns about his safety. This was largely because of the angry reception the Prime Minister had received outside our church on the previous day, although he'd also been heckled himself on an earlier visit to the area. I assured the office that the Mayor, Steve Khan, would be warmly welcomed. In the way of these things, we didn't receive the final confirmation that he was coming till Sunday morning. I found out on my return from a 7 a.m. live interview on the BBC Sunday programme. I never for a moment doubted the type of welcome he would receive. The congregation loved having him with us. His attendance, together with his wife, was a profound and sensitive statement of solidarity. He spent a considerable time after the service listening to people, including many who had lost close friends in the fire. He knew victims by their names. There was a lighter side to the occasions. Dozens of young people had their photos taken alongside him. Their beaming faces told us just how much they looked up to him. He was a role model, a Londoner, a Muslim, of Asian background. He represented the city they knew. He was someone they could admire and possibly emulate. His presence with us brightened their day, providing a brief moment of forgetting. The Mass itself was extraordinarily moving. Approximately 150 people were packed into the small church. The atmosphere was subdued, attentive. From the moment we stood for the opening hymn and prayers, there was a palpable sense of unity. The sermon, preached by Robert Thompson, part-time priest in the parish, and a Labour councillor of, as it happens, Dalgarno Ward, named after the church's founder, and now the chair of the Grenfell Scrutiny Committee, was hard-hitting. He spoke of an inherent brutality in our neoliberal society, with its disregard for the poor, and concluded by quoting from Pope Francis, who articulates so powerfully a divine call for a transformed world and a fresh vision of what it means to be human. There's no doubt that Robert's sermon provoked strong feelings amongst some members of the congregation, but whatever anger they may have felt, it was contained. There was then an emotional transition as we stood for 2 minutes silent prayer. When people came forward immediately afterwards to light candles, there were stations all around the church, there was an extraordinary sense of release. For some, this was the first time they were able to weep. The mutual support of those few moments, the open acknowledgement of the pain we all felt in one way or another, were transformative. Christ came to us in that Eucharist, as he does in every Eucharist, however faithful we may or may not have been, whatever we may be thinking or feeling. In the end, and this is one of the things I've carried away from this terrible experience, this tragedy, this atrocity, in the end, the only way that we can fully articulate our brokenness is through the Eucharist, when the one who was broken on the cross shares himself with us. The structure of the liturgy, enabled those present to feel, if only for an hour and a half, that the chaos of the situation, the turmoil of their feelings, the overwhelming feeling of grief and loss was in some small way finding its expression in a safe place before God. So that was the crucial first few days, and then after the Sunday, the situation gradually became more organised and we moved into the summer period, which was largely one of limbo, a whole series of very angry public meetings, and then I suppose a chapter came to a bit of an end at the end of August. Notting Hill Carnival went very well, it was respectful, and then we got into the sort of autumn back to school time of year, and there was a new sense of purposefulness for people, but it was only ever on the surface. And there's so much more I could say about what's happened as we've journeyed through the autumn. But I will just say three things. First is that trauma, it is said that 90% of trauma is felt in the body. And so when people go back to previous events, they experience them through their bodily reactions, and I think that's very easy to overlook. And that's yet another reason why we need, in terms of our worship, an expression of our bodies, our embodiment, whether it's singing or lighting candles or, crucially, experiencing being part of the Eucharist. So trauma is experienced through the body. The second thing is that there are two key features of trauma. One is a feeling of being overwhelmed, and I hope what I've said tries to take you into that feeling a bit, and that was so strong over the first few weeks and months, and many people still feel it, more or less constantly. But the second thing is broken connections. So we're overwhelmed and we experience broken connections. And so although on the surface a lot is being put in place, although many of the survivors are still in hotel rooms, the vast majority are, the sense of broken connections is so strong. And that's why in meetings, people are fighting all the time. People have known each other for years. I think furious arguments, whether it's at residents' association meetings or whatever. So that sense of broken connections is something which is permeating the whole community, and that's a small indication of how long it's going to take to heal. So I'm going to stop there. I think I've been talking for about half an hour. I'm happy to answer questions. I did write a poem which was published in The Guardian, which some people may have read. If we run out of questions, I'll read the poem towards the end, but please do feel free to ask me anything you like.
Why don't we read that?
Would you like it?
Yes.
It'll take about 10 minutes. It's quite a long poem. Okay. Just going to take this out, it seems to be rustling a bit. In a network of streets divided by cordons, and beyond them all the barrier of jammed cars, there appeared, as if from nowhere, hundreds, no make that thousands of bottles of water, passed from hand to hand as the sun beat down on exposed heads and sweaty backs, on the carless streets, in the blanket of heat we couldn't kick off, trapped in a dream from which we couldn't escape because it wasn't a dream. We hardly slept for days. The crowd that night from the neighbouring blocks, the finger blocks, forced to watch, lights at the windows, torches of those who are still alive for the time being, signalling desperate, faint hope, until floor by floor the darkness snuffed them out. Imagine fire leaping up the building. Imagine cries for help. Imagine screams. Imagine the staircase, the crowded and all too soon impassable single staircase. Imagine the condition of the bodies they managed to recover. Imagine not knowing for days on end whether relatives or friends were still alive, and then still not knowing. No body to lay to rest. And what about the firefighter who wasn't even there, driven to recount what people sound like when they miss the mark, the sound which is like no other, the distinctive and unforgettable sound of impact when a body hits the ground? And what about the firefighters who were there that night, in the early hours of the 14th of June, who kitted up and went straight in, coiling along the floor beneath the smoke, reaching up, grasping hands, guiding survivors out, who haven't yet recovered? It's impossible to picture the street as it was, an ordinary street, at the fringe of the carnival route, when the tower stood out in its smart new cladding, when persistent prophetic warnings fell with a thud on deaf ears before tenants became survivors, trapped in distant hotel rooms, unable to move forward or to go back. A lifeless black block, a grave vessel. Only the visible remains have so far been removed to a location some say is not so far away, where the teeth, the bones, the body parts are being identified for burial or to complete the process of cremation. And now we've started, we can't stop thinking about the location some say is not so far away, where the process, the procedures, God Almighty, the scale of it, the eye for detail, the expertise on which we depend to deliver truth, prosecutions, blind to authority, blind to power, justice for Grenfell. What's justice? Moving upward so slowly, fingertips sifting. They won't be finished until Christmas, they say. Christmas 2017, that is. Remember the year, invisible from out here, but in there, up there, within that silent, perforated tomb, with its single staircase, its devastated rooms, open to the sky, picking their way through matter, organic and inorganic matter, mingled matter, up 23 flights of stairs to the distant upper floors. The building shifts, blocks are evacuated, but the movement is well within the usual parameters. What's usual? Poor souls. That's what people call them in letter after letter. Stripped of bodies, of faces, unrecognizable, except perhaps to God. No flesh anchor to secure them. Naked, exposed. How will they find God without a body? Drifting alone between stars in the empty black ocean. And the poor souls who survived them, stripped of so much, cast adrift. We call them survivors, a label to hold them in place, but they have no place to call home, buffeted by absence. St. Clement's Church, packed out at the parish mass on the first Sunday after the fire, friends and strangers standing so still for the opening prayer, listening so intently to the angry, searing sermon. Clergy so rarely preach sermons like that, which is why so many people wrote to me afterwards to say it almost restored their faith in Christianity. almost. Friends and strangers who wanted to stand alongside one another in silence, in prayer, in grief, in remembrance, who wanted to light a candle, who went forward so swiftly to the stations around the church, who wept at the sight of small flames in trays of sand. Ironic, don't you think? Flames, fire, not at all. Those candles represented life, they represented pain, they represented hope, however fragile. And there was energy that day. We held it together. Anger, respect, release, you name it, it was all there. And between us, we made a difference. And the Eucharist was deep, in a way you cannot capture, because you cannot capture Christ. You cannot capture the Holy Spirit. But now, we're small and disconnected and tired and as powerless as we've ever been. And coming together feels almost too raw. And everywhere you look, there are people walking around in a daze, haunted by ghosts, by images, by voices they try to shut out. And there it is, right there, the dead black block. We see it each morning, filled with debris and dust, when so much was driven out by the fire and carried away by the wind. It's all around us, in the air we breathe, in our tormented nights, in our dreams. And a giant ruptured incinerator is there to greet us, as always, when we awake. Debris. Flickering shadows in the mind. The dead are present, even when we forget them, even in the words we fail to speak. But when concerned observers publish words of anger or distress, attempting to be the voice of those who have lost the most, we're left with little more than dust on our lips.